Gods don't do grudges halfway. No strongly worded letters, no mediation sessions, just cosmic scale violence, mountains used as weapons, and the occasional universe getting rebuilt from scratch. This is every battle between gods explained. 8 fights, 8 mythologies, and absolutely 0 peaceful resolutions. Apollo versus Python. Apollo versus Python is the origin story nobody talks about. Everyone knows Apollo as the golden boy of Olympus, god of music, prophecy, and looking effortlessly perfect. But before he had any of that, he had a snake problem. A very large, very ancient, very territorial snake problem. Python was no ordinary creature. This thing was a child of Gaia herself, the Earth Mother, born from the primordial mud and slime that covered the world after the Great Flood. It had been coiling around Mount Parnassus for so long it practically predated the concept of time. Its job, though nobody formally assigned it, was to guard the sacred site of Delphi, which the Greeks considered the literal navel of the earth, the center of everything, a place of raw oracular power tied to the earth itself. Python breathed poisonous vapors from the cracks in the rock, terrorized the surrounding region, and generally operated as the ancient world's most unsettling landlord. No one challenged it. No one had reason to think anyone could. Then Apollo showed up. He was young, newly divine, and carrying a silver bow he was absolutely ready to use. He tracked Python across the countryside, chasing it all the way back to Delphi, and when he had it cornered, he didn't negotiate. He didn't set a trap or call for backup. He just shot hundreds of arrows until the serpent was finished. It's actually one of the least complicated kills in Greek mythology, which is saying something for a tradition that usually requires elaborate tricks, magical weapons, and divine interference to get anything done. Apollo just showed up and did it. But here's what makes it more than a monster hunt. Python wasn't just a dangerous animal. It was connected to prophetic powers that had always belonged to the earth, to Gaia, deep and ancient, and rooted in the ground itself. By killing it and building his temple directly on that site, Apollo wasn't just clearing real estate. He was taking over. The Oracle of Delphi, the most famous prophecy institution in the ancient world, was established right there, on the ground where Python fell. The priestess who delivered Apollo's divine messages was called the Pythia. His own honorary title became Pythian Apollo. He absorbed the power of the thing he destroyed and wore its name like a trophy. So every time a Greek king or general made the long journey to Delphi to hear their fate, they were standing in the shadow of a god who had walked in, killed the previous tenant, and rebranded the whole operation in his own name. Apollo didn't just win a fight, he turned his enemy's legacy into a monument to himself, which is either brilliant or deeply petty. Knowing Apollo, probably both. Zeus versus Cronus. Zeus versus Cronus is the ultimate story of a prophecy doing exactly what everyone tried to prevent it from doing. It's got titans swallowing babies, a decade-long war that cracked the foundations of reality, and a father so consumed by paranoia that he made absolutely certain his own downfall would happen. Start with Cronus. He already knew how divine succession worked because he was the one who had changed it. He'd taken a sickle to his own father Uranus in an act of cosmic violence so severe it literally rearranged the family tree of mythology. So when a prophecy warned him that his own child would do to him what he'd done to his father, he should have recognized this as simply how things went in divine families. He did not take that lesson. Instead, he swallowed every child his wife Rhea gave birth to. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each one gone. Like a titan who'd decided fatherhood was a security risk and handled it accordingly. Rhea watched 5 children disappear, and eventually she had enough. When Zeus was born, she wrapped a rock in cloth and handed it to Cronus with a straight face. He swallowed it without looking. Zeus was smuggled to Crete, raised in secret, and when he returned, he was not interested in reconciliation. He fed Cronus a potion that reversed everything. The Titan vomited up all 5 siblings, fully grown and extremely motivated, and the Olympians were suddenly an army with a very personal grievance. What followed was the Titanomachy, 10 years of war that shook the cosmos from its foundations. Mountains were weapons, seas were battlefields. For a decade, neither side could land a decisive blow. The stalemate held until Zeus made one move that broke it entirely. He descended into Tartarus and freed the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed giants that Cronus had kept locked away, presumably because imprisoning your most powerful potential allies is the strategy of someone who deserves what's coming to him. The Cyclopes repaid the favor immediately. They forged thunderbolts for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, and a helm of invisibility for Hades. Armed with those weapons and the Hecatoncheires hurling boulders by the hundreds, the Titans collapsed. Cronus was thrown into Tartarus, the same pit he'd used to cage his enemies, and the Olympians took the cosmos. Cronus had eaten his children, imprisoned his strongest allies, and launched a war across all of creation to stop one prophecy. He ended up in exactly the place fate said he would, just considerably more defeated than the version he'd been trying to avoid. You can swallow all the rocks you want. Destiny does not negotiate. Heracles versus Ares. Heracles beating monsters is expected. That's essentially his professional identity. What's less expected and considerably more entertaining is Heracles fighting an actual Olympian god in open combat and winning, specifically wounding Ares, the god of war, the divine embodiment of violence and military destruction, with a spear to the thigh and sending him limping off the field. There is no version of this story that reflects well on the god of war. The context matters. Cycnus was Ares' son, and he'd developed a charming hobby of ambushing pilgrims traveling to Apollo's sacred shrine and collecting their skulls with the stated intention of building a temple from them, which is, even by Greek mythological standards, excessive. Heracles was traveling through the same region because Heracles was always passing through somewhere that needed handling, and he challenged Cycnus. The fight was brief. Cycnus died. That should have been the end of it. Ares didn't see it that way. He arrived in full war god mode, armed and furious, ready to make a demigod understand the consequences of killing divine offspring. By any calculation, a god arriving to fight a half-mortal should have been a short and one-sided encounter. Heracles didn't back down. He engaged Ares directly, and at some point during the fight drove a spear into the god's thigh. Ares, bleeding and genuinely wounded, had to be pulled from the battlefield by his sons Deimos and Phobos, which are fear and panic respectively, and that sentence is entirely real. The living personification of war, the god whose whole identity was built around being unstoppable in combat, needed to be rescued by his divine children named Fear and Panic, while a half-mortal stood there, still breathing, apparently not particularly inconvenienced. Apollo was present during the battle and backed Heracles at a crucial moment, which is worth acknowledging. But Heracles still landed the blow and Ares still retreated, and that's the part that matters. What this story actually communicates is something the Greeks believed deeply about the nature of conflict. Ares was rage without direction, violence for its own sake, the mindless charge that didn't calculate or adapt or reconsider. He was power in its most undisciplined form. Heracles, for all the superhuman strength, represented something different. Strength applied with intention, force used with purpose rather than momentum. Against focused will, pure aggression walks away with a spear wound and a damaged reputation. Ares never seemed to internalize this lesson, which might explain his consistently poor track record in mythology's more interesting fights. You'd think the god of war would be better at it. Apparently being war and understanding it are two different things. Lug versus Balor, Irish mythology's most decisive battle, comes down to a grandson using a sling stone to drive his grandfather's own eye backward through his skull, and this is considered one of the great heroic victories in Celtic tradition, which tells you a great deal about how Irish mythology operates. Balor of the Evil Eye was the king of the Fomorians, the monstrous primordial beings who had been disrupting Ireland and fighting the Tuatha De Danann since before anyone could measure. The Fomorians were the dark side of nature given form, and Balor was their ultimate weapon. His eye was not dangerous in the way a sword is dangerous. When that eyelid was fully lifted, everything in its line of sight died. Armies, not soldiers, armies. The eye was so heavy and so catastrophically powerful that it required 4 men and a polished handle to raise the lid, making Balor's face the world's oldest recorded weapon of mass destruction. He didn't need strategy or planning. He showed up, someone lifted the lid, and the opposing side stopped existing. The Tuatha De Danann had Lug. Lug was exceptional, even by divine standards. He was the god of light, skill, and mastery across every craft and discipline, and he was talented in so many areas that when he first tried to enter the divine court, they turned him away because they already had specialists for everything he listed. He kept naming abilities until they ran out of reasons to refuse him. He was also Balor's grandson because in in Celtic mythology, the most dangerous person in any room is invariably related to the most dangerous person in the opposite room. At the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, the two armies collided in a fight that was supposed to settle the fate of Ireland permanently. Balor moved across the battlefield, and warriors fled ahead of him rather than face what the open eye would do. Even divine combatants rerouted. He was simply too much to approach frontally. Lug's answer was to not be in the front. He waited for the precise moment the lid was being raised, loaded his sling, and fired from the side. The stone connected with enough force to drive the eye backward through Balor's skull, and when it emerged from the other side, it was facing his own army. Every Fomorian in range was killed by their own champion's power in an instant. The battle's entire balance shifted in one stone's worth of time. Lug didn't need to overpower Balor. He needed one clear angle and correct timing. The most devastating weapon in Irish mythology became the instrument of its own army's destruction because someone thought about geometry instead of fighting harder. In mythology, as in most things, perfect timing tends to beat raw power. Durga versus Mahishasura. When every god in the Hindu pantheon had tried and failed, when the heavens had been conquered and the divine order had completely collapsed, the solution wasn't to find a stronger god. It was to combine all of them into something that had never existed before. That's Durga, and the demon who forced that to happen was Mahishasura, a buffalo demon who nearly won everything by being extremely specific about the terms of his own invincibility. Mahishasura performed extraordinary devotion and penance until Brahma appeared and offered him a boon, and instead of asking for wisdom or divine grace, he asked for protection from every man and god in existence, listing every category of being he could think of. He forgot women. Every account of this story frames it as arrogance rather than oversight. He simply did not consider a woman a threat worth including. This particular assumption ends empires. Armed with his protection, Mahishasura tore through heaven. He defeated Indra, drove the gods from their own realm, and ruled the celestial world for 100 years while the divine order wandered in exile, unable to fight back. Eventually, the gods assembled and the conclusion was unanimous. We cannot defeat this. We need something the boon doesn't cover. From the combined divine energy of every god, Durga emerged. Shiva gave her his trident, Vishnu gave her his disc, Indra gave her his thunderbolt, Yama gave her a staff, Varuna gave her a conch, 8 arms, each carrying a weapon from a different deity, riding a lion that was itself a divine gift. She rode out carrying the accumulated arsenal of everything the heavens had to offer. Mahishasura fought back, and he was not passive about it. He shapeshifted repeatedly throughout the battle, cycling through forms trying to find something that could survive what she was doing to him. Buffalo, then lion, then man with sword, then elephant, then back to buffalo in a final attempt at his most powerful natural state. Durga matched every transformation without hesitation or adjustment because she had been built specifically for this fight and no form he chose changed. What she was. When he came at her as the buffalo demon in full force, she pinned him, drove her spear through him, and it was over. What Durga represents structurally is the actual point of the story. She isn't simply a goddess who won a fight. She is the collective will of a broken divine order, poured together and given the exact shape required to close the one gap that had been left open. Mahishasura thought his imagination was equal to the universe's possibilities. He was wrong by exactly one category. Thor versus Hrungnir. Thor fights giants in Norse mythology with such regularity that it barely counts as news. But his duel with Hrungnir is different from the usual giant smashing for one very specific reason. It nearly killed him. He won anyway, and he spent the rest of Norse mythology walking around with a piece of a whetstone permanently lodged in his skull. He won the fight. He just also lost a small but irretrievable fragment of his forehead in the process. The setup begins, as many Norse disasters do, with Odin making a reckless decision for entertainment purposes. He got into a horse race with Hrungnir, the strongest giant alive, and won. But during the resulting visit, Hrungnir ended up inside Asgard, drinking the god's mead, growing louder and more threatening with each cup, until he was promising to rip up Valhalla, drown Asgard, and take Freya and Sif home with him. The gods were unimpressed. Thor arrived and issued a formal challenge, one-on-one, a duel. Hrungnir accepted. The giants were nervous, not not because their champion was expected to lose, but because the stakes were too high to leave to chance. So they built a clay giant named Kalfi to fight alongside Hrungnir, 9 miles tall, animated with a mare's heart because no human heart could be found large enough. It had been given size and the theoretical ability to fight. What it hadn't been given was courage. When Kalfi got its first look at Thor arriving on the battlefield, it was so terrified it destroyed itself from the inside before the fight even started. Not an encouraging sign for the giant's plan. Hrungnir was made of stone throughout. Heart of stone, head of stone, weapon a massive whetstone. He stood there like a geological event that had developed opinions. Thialfi, Thor's companion, ran ahead and convinced him that Thor was tunneling underground for a surprise attack. So Hrungnir positioned his stone shield beneath his feet and left himself completely undefended from the front. When Thor charged, Hrungnir hurled the whetstone and Thor threw Mjolnir simultaneously. The hammer hit Hrungnir's stone head and shattered it. The whetstone hit Mjolnir mid-air, broke apart, and one fragment drove itself into Thor's forehead. Thor collapsed under Hrungnir's falling body, pinned by the dead giant's legs, and it took his 3-day-old son Magni to lift the corpse off him. Everyone else apparently was not strong enough, which says a great deal about both the size of Hrungnir and the DNA running through Asgard. The whetstone never came out. Seers tried to remove it. It stayed. Thor won the duel, killed the strongest giant in existence, and came home with a permanent piece of the enemy embedded in his head, which is either embarrassing or the most Viking accessory ever conceived. Given that he apparently never mentioned it as a problem, he was probably fine with it. Vishnu versus Hiranyakashipu. Hiranyakashipu is the rare mythological villain whose defeat says more about the nature of the divine than it does about the demon himself. He built what appeared to be an airtight defense. He identified every conceivable way he could be killed and closed each option one by one with surgical precision. And Vishnu responded by becoming something that existed outside every category the boon had named, in a form the universe had never produced before, specifically to walk through the one gap that arrogance had left open. It starts with grief and fury. Hiranyakashipu watched his brother get killed by Vishnu and decided the appropriate response was extreme devotion until Brahma had no choice but to appear and grant a boon. His request was the most elaborate survival clause in Hindu mythology. He could not be killed by human or beast, not inside or outside, not during day or not during night, not on earth and not in the sky, not by any living thing and not by any weapon. He had covered everything. He was certain. He had forgotten one shape that reality could take, not because it existed and he missed it, but because it had never existed yet at all. With the protection secured, he declared himself supreme, banned the worship of every god, and held the celestial realm by force. Then his own son Prahlad turned out to be Vishnu's most devoted worshipper. Hiranyakashipu tried to kill him every way available: poison, trampling elephants, throwing him from cliffs, burning him alive. Prahlad survived every attempt, protected by the god his father despised most. The more it failed, the more unhinged Hiranyakashipu became. At the final confrontation, he pointed at a palace pillar and screamed, "Is your god in there? Is he hiding in that stone?" Vishnu stepped out of the pillar, not as a god, not as a man, not as an animal, as Narasimha, the man lion, a form that had never existed before in any mythology or cosmology, half human and half lion, sitting outside every category the boon had covered. He carried Hiranyakashipu to the threshold of the palace, the doorway between inside and outside. He held him on his lap between earth and sky. It was dusk, the border between day and night. He used claws, not weapons, and he killed him while honoring every single condition of the protection that had been granted. Every door was still closed. Vishnu had simply walked in through the wall. Hiranyakashipu's mistake wasn't that his boon was imprecise. It was that he believed his imagination was the ceiling of what was possible. When you're dealing with the force that maintains balance in the universe, that assumption tends not to hold. Marduk versus Kingu. The Babylonian creation myth gives us one of the stranger origin stories for humanity ever recorded, not shaped from love or breathed into existence or carefully molded from sacred earth, made from the blood of a defeated general. Kingu didn't volunteer for this role. He was simply on the losing side of a divine conflict and ended up as the founding biological material of an entire species, which is either the bleakest creation story in mythology or simply the most direct one. Tiamat was the primordial salt sea, mother of the original god, gods, and for a long time she was patient. Then Apsu the Freshwater decided the younger gods were too noisy and plotted to kill them. Ea killed Apsu first. Tiamat, grieving and enraged, built an army. Dragons, serpents, scorpion men, monsters of every category assembled under her command. To lead them, she elevated Kingu, binding the Tablet of Destinies directly to his chest. The tablet was authority over fate made physical. Whoever held it commanded the cosmos. Kingu wore it and marched. The gods looked for someone to fight her and came up short repeatedly. Several tried, failed, and came back with nothing to show for it. Eventually, Marduk stepped forward with terms that were entirely non-negotiable. He would fight, but win or lose, he would be named Supreme King above every other god. No exceptions, no caveats. They agreed without much debate because their alternatives had run out. Marduk came to battle with a net, the four winds, a hurricane, a flood weapon, and lightning. When he faced Tiamat, he spread his net around her and drove the winds directly into her open mouth until she couldn't close it. Immobilized and inflated, she had no way to fight back. He drove his spear through her heart and split her in half. Her upper half became the sky, her lower half became the earth. Her eyes fed the Tigris and Euphrates. Her tail became the Milky Way. The cosmos wasn't formed from nothing or from love. It was assembled from the remains of the last thing that tried to destroy it. Then came Kingu, captured after the battle, brought before the divine assembly, charged with starting the war. They executed him, and from his blood they fashioned humanity, not as a reward, not as a celebration, as a workforce. Humans were created to do the labor required to maintain the divine order so the gods wouldn't have to do it themselves. Kingu had been given supreme authority over fate, command of the most fearsome army ever assembled, and the Tablet of Destinies tied to his chest. He had been elevated as high as any being in creation. His legacy was becoming the raw material for an entire species, not because he was honored, but because he was available, and the gods needed a biological ingredient. In the grand ledger of mythological losses, that one sits near the top. If you enjoyed this, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you're already hungry for more, there's a suggested video right there. Click it, you won't regret it.